So thank you very much for being here. I have a few brochures here as well then that we can distribute later that explain a little bit more what we're doing. And so what I would like to do is to focus on the city applications of the ecological footprint. And the question would be, why now? Why would we use an ecological footprint for cities? And the essence is really what is also the essence of WRI. WRI really stands for, as one of the unique institutions, to recognize the significance of resource security for the world. A topic that is too underemphasized, I believe. We're now in a new world, in a full world, where human demand is becoming so large that it's becoming a geological force. Some people call it the Anthropocene. But it's even, to the extent that now what we use cannot be regenerated at the same rate by Earth. And that puts it in a new context. So how do we measure resource security? How do we put it into a context that we can understand and manage it? And to do that, I would like to do 4 things. I'd like to meander, so that's why I structured it a little bit. Like, these 4 things are, first, to explain why looking at the world from a biocapacity perspective helps us to understand the resource aspects more easily, how that then does translate in footprint work, how to use the ecological footprint as a resource accounting tool, then go a little bit broader, how to look at sustainable development more broadly as a framework, and then more specifically again on cities. How can it be applied? What have we done? And how could we move forward from there? So let's look at the resource cake as a whole. And probably the big driver right now you're most aware of is the amazing breakthrough in Paris that we collectively agreed that 2 degrees Celsius increase above industrial levels would not be acceptable to humanity. And if we look IPCC studies in the eyes, what we will see is that there's no argument that we can be above 450 ppm CO2 equivalent if we want to commit to that goal. And then we even said 1.5, which would make it even more stringent. So 450 ppm CO2 equivalent would be the max. Now, what does that mean? We can look at how much we have already now. Mauna Loa in Hawaii measures about 407 ppm today. That's just CO2. If we include non-CO2, it may be as high as 470, but it's hard to exactly pin it down. But just CO2 is 407. We have increased the ppm level per year by about 2.1 ppms. So you can do a very simple primary school calculation of what does that mean in terms of budget available, and you come to the conclusion of maximum 20 years. That's kind of the most optimistic view of how much CO2 is left if you want to stay with the Paris Declaration. So we could even say, okay, let's use it for 20 years and then stop there, or we could do it more slowly, and by 2050 be out of using fossil fuel or net CO2 emissions, and that comes into this very complicated chemical formula of 0 CO2 by 2050. So that's basically the challenge we're in. So that's the CO2 part. But then if we move out of CO2, where do we get the energy from? How do we do that without trashing the rest of the planet by cutting more trees to fry our chickens, etc.? So we need to look at it more broadly and say, what's the ultimate resource budget? And that's where, when we look at it a little bit broader, CO2 and beyond, what we recognize is what truly can power us is what we call biocapacity, renewable capacity of the planet. Or another way, biologists recognize that life competes for ecologically productive surfaces. Life competes for ecologically productive surfaces, and so the surfaces that we use for our potatoes, others cannot use for their potatoes, and the bear cannot use for what they want to do. So we can add up all the various areas that compete for space, and that's what we call our ecological footprint. That's what I will show, how does it work. So the ecological footprint is exactly that, a very simple idea. It's actually so simple, my mother wasn't as impressed as you. She said, oh my God, it's so simple, how can you get a PhD for that? You've got to be wary, do something more complicated. But in the end, it's just kind of adding up the areas that compete for ecologically productive space. activities. So you add them up. Potatoes, cotton, coffee. A big part now is CO2, because we would have enough space on the planet to absorb all the excess CO2, but then we wouldn't have enough space to produce all the food. So that adds up all the ecological footprint. We have one second, that's the first innovation. The second innovation is to recognize not every area, here we call it acres in the United States, and the most of the world we call it hectares, are born equally. So they are like more productive ones, less productive ones. So we stretch the hectares proportional to their productivity, so we can compare hectares across the world in a common unit, like a common currency of the world, a physical currency. We call it global hectares. And so we can compare how much we have to how much we use. So this is the world trends overall per person. We see there's less biocapacity available per person. That's the green line. It doesn't decline as rapidly as the population, because also we have been able to increase productivity through manipulation of ecosystems. But the demand per person has been relatively flat over the last 30 years. If we look at it as a world map and say, how have things changed over time? Every country is different. How much did they use compared to how much they have back in 1960, when I was about born? So we can see the colonial past, the red dots, Europe and Japan. We can also see the United States starting to have a very large consumption, even though they have a lot of biocapacity, but the world mostly green. And this is how the world has changed over my lifetime. So right now we have 85% of the world population living in countries that use more than what their ecosystems can renew. How is that possible? How is it possible that worldwide we can use 60% more than what Earth can renew? It's possible because, like with money, we can spend more than we earn. Like with trees, we can cut them more quickly than they regrow. We can pump water out of the groundwater more rapidly than it recharges. We can fish more quickly than fish restocks. We can pump CO2 more quickly in the atmosphere than it's being absorbed by the biosphere, etc. It's very possible. And the feedback loop is very slow, and that's why economists wonder, if we use so much more, why is GDP still growing? Why is there not feedback? And it's because there are very big time lags. So nature is very generous in some ways, and there's a lot of assets that we can deplete. But in the long run, that becomes tighter and more difficult. Now, every country looks very different. That's important too. It's not just kind of a global trend. It actually very much matters how you act. And that's perhaps the most significant thing I will say. That's true for cities as well. If you're not ready, you are not ready. It matters what you do. So it's not just a big global trend. It differs. And here we see South America, very high biocapacity per person. But even Brazil and Colombia, they're very rich in it. And because they're rich, they can be foolish. They lose it very quickly on a per capita basis. Central America, much tighter than South America. You can look at these trends on our website, footprintnetwork.org/maps. We'll give you a lot of time trends that you can observe. How do we apply it to cities? Here's an example from the Mediterranean region where we looked at about 20 cities. In a very simple way, we just looked at, for all their resource demand, how much area, how much biocapacity is necessary to support them. And then we could compare it with the biocapacity of the country. So we can see, for example, here, Athens, that's the size of Athens, compared to the size of Greece. Athens on its own uses more resources than all of Greece can regenerate, for example. And so we can also see, like, Egypt looks very small compared to Turkey. It's because Egypt has a lot of desert, so the productivity of Egypt is concentrated in small areas. So on average, it has much less biocapacity per area, so it looks smaller. So that just kind of shows the challenges of kind of how do we power these cities in the long run if they already use that much. So we talked about biocapacity. Why is it the overarching resource? It's the overarching resource because we're not limited by fossil fuel. We're limited by the Earth's ability to regenerate. And so we're looking at that as the overarching view. It gives us a sense of the metabolism. We looked at how the ecological footprint works as a way to just add up in a very simple accounting ways the demands that we have and compare that to the availability. And now the question is, how do we apply it? And I would like to start from just looking at it more broadly. How could we frame sustainable development? And sustainable development is beautiful because it already explains a complicated concept in 2 words. Development, essentially, is a commitment to great lives. We all want to have great lives. And why do we call it sustainable development and not accelerated development? So many people clearly need better lives. Why not accelerated development? It's a recognition that there's a budget constraint. And the budget constraint is essentially the resource security issue. How can we power development? So sustainable stands for the reality of one planet. So that makes it kind of this soccer game between these two teams, that we want to have great lives, and we could measure that possibly with the Human Development Index, the first approximation of good life. And then how can we measure our overall resource demand? We use the ecological footprint for it. And when we then look at this in a two-dimensional graph and say one axis is how well do we live, Human Development Index, you probably know, has three key factors. The logarithm of income, how long do people live, and do they have access to basic education and literacy. 1 is nirvana, 0 is not so great. Then the other axis would then be the resource demand. We look at it, to what extent do we fit on the planet? So we use for that the ecological footprint. Then what we can see is kind of this interesting distribution of lower human development outcomes using fewer resources. As we go to higher human development, it seems to use more resources. There are a number of interesting things. One is we can compare resource demand to how much is available on the planet. The green horizontal line here shows how much biocapacity there is per person on the planet. E.O. Wilson, you may have heard of, he's a biologist. He just came out with his new book called Half Earth, of saying if we want, like we are 100 million species, we are one species, how much should we take? He says, let's take half. Let's be generous to the others and give half to the others. We're just one species. So if that was the case, then you would have biocapacity only at half the level, obviously. So that would be lower. So 1.7 hectares here is to use the entire cake. And then the vertical lines, they show where high or very high human development starts according to the United Nations. And so the yellow box here really is an invitation, we call it always, to think inside the box. It's the minimal conditions globally where we need to be in order to have sustainable development. High human development within a resource demand that can be replicated globally. So it's not a sufficient condition possible for sustainable development, but there's no argument you can make that we could be outside of that box and be sustainable on average. So it's a quantitative minimal condition. What is also interesting about this graph is that you see this trend moving up, but also there are huge differences between the footprint demand of a given HDI. So that's just nation by nation. And these nations didn't even try to have a small footprint, but just it shows it's not a physical law per se. It just, if we don't pay attention, it seems that we use more resources as we move up in human development. So what does that mean? So traditionally, we just say, let's just focus on development, and we would call that palliative in the sense that we're, yes, improving the comfort a little bit for a short while, but it's not really building the stability that we need. What we then often see is that particularly for lower income countries that cannot afford getting the resources from other places, you have this inverted C curves of collapse. You try to get more, but you don't have the resources. It weakens you also on the social side. You don't have the resources to have better health systems and have better economies, and so it leads to a collapse situation. So what we really need is transformative path. How can we drive development forward in a way that it's becoming more resource secure? That's the big question. And it's a very difficult question, and we don't know yet. That's why you're here and many more need to be here. That should be the question that is stated at the entrance gate of any university in the world, and we don't do that yet. That's the question of all questions, I believe, for the 21st century. So when we look at other measures, and here I'm going to start to be a little bit politically incorrect perhaps, but we just looked at the Sustainable Development Goals, and they cannot be quantified. Jeffrey Sachs came up with a Sustainable Development Index, which basically looks at current countries' compliance with the Sustainable Development Goals. So assuming you just use the KPI, the Sustainable Development Goals as your KPIs, how would you perform? And what we found is that the top 20 countries are all countries, with one exception, that has a footprint over 5 hectares, while we only have 1.7 available. The one exception is the UK. They have 4.94. So we calculate if there was no correlation between resource demand, and human outcome, what would be the likelihood that the top 20 countries would all have a 5-hectare footprint? And it's like less than a tenth of a billionth of a probability that it would just, if it's just a random occurrence. And we also see at the bottom end, all the lowest ones in the ranking, they're all on this side. In reality, if the highest ranking should be here, second highest here, third ranking here, fourth ranking here, they should go in this direction. Now they're going in this direction. So in other words, the Sustainable Development Goals, even though they have the word sustainable in there, are really development goals. So there's nothing wrong with development. That's what we want to achieve. But if we don't achieve it with resource security at its center, it's absolutely anti-poor. Because I told you 85% of the world population live in countries that have a resource deficit. But actually 71% of the world population live in a country that both have an ecological deficit and have less income than world average. Why world average? If you're less than world average income, less likely that you can net buy stuff from others than what others buy from you. So 71% of the world population is now in that situation. It's a very, very high challenge. So therefore, I think the significance of getting sustainable development right and not just following KPIs that actually in the end are just called sustainable, but in the end don't deliver the resource security that all of us need, but particularly lowest income people need, is very dangerous. So now let's go to cities. What does it mean for cities? I showed you already a first assessment of the risk. What are city exposures? So we can analyze cities through a lot of proxy data. But the question is, how can we use this information best? One city that has used the footprint a lot, because they had a lot of resources, because they got a lot of oil, they had a whole footprint department, their planning department, is Calgary. They had a nice boot of the footprint. And interesting enough, with all the analysis we did, we put in one graph in the report that had the biggest impact, and that was this one, which basically was just a question of locked-in infrastructure. So we basically showed how many planets we have now and we will have in the future. We believe it's one. Elon Musk is probably not fast enough to get us a second one in time. But so there's one here. And then we compared that with how much do we use as humanity compared to that. So the graph is a little bit wobbled, but we use less than one planet but in the 60s. And if we look at the trajectory of the United Nations, both in terms of population increase and just kind of the International Energy Agency's estimates of what kind of energy levels we will need, we seem to go straight up there and use more and more planets. And what hits us is not just how much more we use, but it cumulatively increases the debt of resources that we have. The ecological debt increases. So we can compare the lifespan of stocks we put in place, like a power plant, streets, houses, etc., and compare that with the lifespan of kind of the planetary trajectory. So we start to see, wow, the things we build right now will affect the way we will live in the future quite dramatically. Does it fit still in the context of where we will be? So we can lock ourselves into great solutions, into great cities that operate well and become more and more valuable as we move into a world of climate change and resource constraints, or we can lock ourselves out by building things that we cannot operate and will be hit twice. Not only will the value of these assets be stranded and be lost, but it will be lost at a time when the economy is doing very poorly, where we cannot afford not to have our savings. Savings are for the worst times to compensate, and having strategy where actually our savings vanish at the time when we need them is particularly foolish. So anyhow, having seen that, even the budget people in Calgary said at the time, I don't know if they maintained it, they said, we cannot afford green space development anymore. We need to do fill-in, because if you have like larger and larger cities, it takes more and more snow plowing and longer pipes, etc. That doesn't make any sense. We should not have a moratorium on green space development. Hasn't made them fully sustainable, but I think it's interesting that they started to recognize, wow, that's not serving us economically. We also worked with the province of Guizhou. It's not directly city applied, but it has the same ideas, and I will just show you one key idea that we came up with. We basically helped them analyze the resource efficiency or the footprint efficiency of the various sectors. So you see on the bottom line, on the horizontal line, the whole GDP, how is it generated, and what's the resource intensity to generate in the various sectors their value add. If you compare that with the intensity available on the planet, like if you divided the entire biocapacity of the planet by the GDP of the planet, currently the green line, 170 global hectares per $1 million, would be what's available. And if you leave half for half the species, it would be even lower. And so you can start to see how much of your economy is currently not fit for the future. So it will hurt you in being able to generate income needed to operate your country or your city. So it's another way of looking at the thing from a much more self-centered perspective. Will you be able to operate? We work with the United Arab Emirates. And there's also, they said, how can we reduce our footprint? They quite recognize the resource challenge that they need to move out of fossil fuel economy. But again, also their alternative economy that they're building is extremely resource dependent. Right now, for example, the tourist industry has double as high of a resource intensity as it takes them to export oil. So the oil sector now is half as resource intensive per dollar value add than their tourism industry. So just, again, one blip from that report, there's much more, but is to say, okay, we help them to think about what are the key factors, not in mathematical ways, but in kind of thinking buckets of what you can do to address this problem. One is the way you build your cities. And you probably know about Masdar. They try to say, are the new urban forms that would serve us much better in having a low footprint, high quality of life situation. And the extreme contrasts between different city forms in the UAE makes a big difference, and you have worked on that as well. The second one, obviously, is how do we generate the resources that we use? How do we get the water? How do we get the energy? Energy particularly has huge opportunities to dematerialize, if you think photovoltaics versus coal. Food is an important part because we cannot decouple from food, otherwise we don't live. Food is very essential. But there's food waste, there's way we live on the food chain, very important. And the fourth part, which may be difficult but is a huge driver, is how many people are we to share the planet? Are there opportunities to drive that trend? And actually it is possible to do it in a way that are very pro-human, pro-family, pro-women particularly, by making sure women and men have the same opportunities, etc. It's possible to drive perhaps us even to a shrinking population. There may be an advantage of a slowly shrinking population as well. That's another discussion we could have. So what are the particular opportunities? And I would like just to summarize the core ideas of where we think we could drive cities if we take resource security as a key issue for cities, which I think currently, even in the sustainable development debate, is underestimated. And we don't even talk about sustainability. We just say, we want you as a city to be successful. What does it take? We're not giving you sustainability indicators. We're giving you success indicators. What does it take to be successful in the current world? That's a different word. So I will say the same things in three ways, just kind of to repeat myself. I think maybe it's so simple that it's too simple. I don't know. But the idea is, if you accept resource security as a key driver, really you have to ask yourself two questions for every dollar you spend. And that's how we build the future, with every dollar we spend. And some dollars are already preset. You cannot change them. Then you need to work the other dollars even harder. So if that's the case. So one is, does your project drive resource security? Or translate in our language and say, to what extent is it driving down your footprint? Is it reducing your footprint? And actually, if you think you have to get to a certain goal and you have a certain budget, you could even say, per dollar, how much do you have to drive it down to really make a dent in the trajectory you need to take? That's one question. And that's differently calculated than just looking at the national total. You have to kind of specifically look at the project and understand its impact on the entire system, and kind of from a bottom-up calculate where it shaves off footprint and how it does that. And the second question is a very simple one too, is to say, does it generate financial gain? Because if you make investments that are not net positive, even governments cannot maintain them. If you want to scale something, it has to be net positive financially. Then you can also bring in private investments. So I show you the same thing again, just as a picture. Two questions, independent questions, both important. Is it reducing our footprint? is it increasing our net wealth? And when I say net wealth, what we call that net present value plus. It's 85% is net present value. It's basically saying what is the life cycle value, including net value, including costs and benefits over its entire life, that is being generated to the investor. So it's not about externalities, it's about to the investor. Is the investor getting better off? And of course, cities, they capture a lot of the externalities. So there's a lot of values that you can actually capture and look at it. Why do we call it net present value plus? The plus brings two additions to a very cool tool, the net present value. One is to say, let's count everything that is relevant, because often we don't include many things. We just talked about very interesting indicators that Sebastian, you're working on, that look at the multiple benefits that are being generated through sustainable solutions. And that's a big difficulty in sustainability, that like industrial approaches, they have like one big gain, like the new nuclear power plant, a lot of money, and a lot of electricity being generated, and the downsides are a bit diffuse. And with sustainability, we say, oh, it's a big cost, but we don't see all the values because they're diffuse. But there's so many benefits of sustainable city investments as health benefits, well-being benefits, real estate benefits, brand benefits, long-term value benefits by being less resource dependent, being more stable, etc. So we have a little sheet that I can send out that kind of just summarizes the idea of saying, why do we need the ecological footprint to kind of look at the resource demand? What exactly does net present value do? So that's one thing, as I said, is it calculates we have to calculate everything. So it's not a new invention, it's just making NPV stronger. And the second thing, which is not done either, which I think is even more fundamental, is to say, in order to calculate correctly, or not correctly, but more accurately what the net present value is, you need to be explicit about your assumptions about the future. Because that determines, to a large extent, what parameters to use. I think probably the more significant parameter is to say, what kind of discount rates should you use? And we're using excessively high discount rates currently. We undervalue the future, which I think is not warranted. There are more and more economic papers coming out showing that even a 1% discount rate probably may be even too high. So we should look at really kind of, that shifts the game around net present value. But I think you need to have the buy-in of your client of saying, what exactly are we expecting and what kind of parameters could we use? So that's kind of the introduction. So we have enough time for discussions. We can go into details. Just to repeat again, we looked at why is biocapacity a good kind of mother of all resources. Why does it summarize the overall metabolism? And the various parts are very different, obviously, in time delays and the mechanics, but overall, it's like looking at a farm. How big is the farm we have compared to how big is our hunger? And that's what the footprint does. It's an accounting system. It's more like a question of saying resource security really matters. How do we handle that? And does it biophysically? Because physics doesn't change over time as much. There's this, I don't know if you know probably about the diamond water dilemma. Why are diamonds so much more expensive than water when diamond doesn't really add to life, you know? To some people's lives it does, but overall, when water is much more essential, why is that? And that's because of the marginal value problem. Economists realize that it's much easier to get the next liter of water or kilo of water or pound of water or whatever unit as compared to the next kilo of diamond. So that's why monetary assessments tell us something about social preferences at the moment. Physical assessments tell us about kind of the physics, the mechanics of the world. And so by having the contrast between the two, that actually starts to give us insights. If they're aligned, great. If they're not aligned, then they give us information. Then the framing around sustainable development, I believe going back to the core soccer game, what are the two teams that play against each other? And what's the essence of that? By focusing on that, we can make it more interesting and can come up with ways to overcome this dilemma. There are trade-offs, but we can actually find win-win opportunities if we focus on it. And so then for the applications, yes, we need to understand resource risks, but I think as important to get people going is also to help them show where can you pick your wins, where can you drive sustainability and also be financially responsible. I think what holds us back in various cities probably is that more progressive mayors possibly are afraid of being too progressive because they will be attacked for squandering money. But if we can help them show that their choices not only drives them towards a better future, but also is fiscally highly responsible, we get much more buy-in, and we may even be leveraging investments from private sources as well. So with that, I would like to come to the conclusion of the formal introduction so we can have more conversations. We can go into more technical details. Whatever is on your mind, that's what I'm here for, and I thank you for your interest. And I put out like this little list if you want to put on your email. Please do, so we can stay in communication. We have a newsletter that comes out, and then I also had some brochures here that summarize the same idea in graphical format. Or come to our website at footprintnetwork.org and visit us there. Thank you very much.